Thank you so much for hosting us here, this beautiful new building. It's been wonderful pleasure to be here over the last 2 days and get to know Antwerp a little bit and get to know the wonderful colleagues who've come to build this research agenda for Europe. This is something, as Kat mentioned, that we've been working on. We're doing this global research agenda for service learning community engagement. It's been 5 years in the works. We've gathered many data points through these data collection forums we've held across the globe. And we've had our European meeting. We're going to have one in Asia and Hong Kong in 2 weeks. Then we're going down to Latin America, to Buenos Aires, and then we'll have one in the US. And we're looking at developing one in Australia and in Africa as well. And all these regional research agendas are going to be compiled into a global research agenda to help us think about what are the future goals for research for advancing the field of service learning community engagement. So I thank everyone who participated in the European agenda. And thank you all very much for taking time out of your evening to join today for this session on consideration strategies for evaluating service learning impact. For those of us who are involved in service learning, see many of the benefits that service learning has for our students and our institutions, and especially for our communities. And at service learning conferences, we share a lot of the wonderful stories and anecdotes about the benefits and impacts that service learning has. And so while these stories and anecdotes are important and they are very valuable, capturing and measuring the outcomes of service learning experiences is quite elusive and actually very difficult to do in a very systematic way. And frankly, the service learning field has struggled to be able to develop universally applicable tools that can be applied in many different service learning situations. And the mechanisms for evaluating the impact of service learning continue to challenge us in terms of how to capture those outcomes that we purport, that we anecdotally share in a very systematic way. And that's one of the things we've been working on with the research agenda, trying to systematize that. But the reality is that most of the measures that we develop for individuals for service learning are for individual projects and individual experiences. And this is because service learning is highly contextualized. The practice is operating in many different places, in different academic disciplines. It's situated in different communities, addresses different societal issues, and the duration and intensity vary. And service learning serves different purposes. It's not a treatment. It's not something that looks the same in every situation. And in fact, no two service learning experiences are alike. So thinking about that and how to go about evaluating those impacts becomes the real challenge for us. And that's what we've trying to unpack over the many years, 30 plus years I've been involved in this field. So being able to then develop a common evaluation strategy to measure the impact of service learning, or to develop the tools and instruments we need to be able to measure these impacts, can be very difficult, I would say, if not impossible. It is not uncommon for those of us who are interested in evaluating the impacts of service learning to adopt existing instruments that are out there. A lot of us have evaluated our own service learning experiences, and we tend to sometimes take those instruments and adopt them. And this approach can work and is appropriate if the context of the service learning experience we want to measure is similar to how those instruments were developed and for the purposes they were developed. Perhaps the most common question I get asked is, I'm using service learning with my students in my course, in my classroom. How do I measure and evaluate the impact of service learning? How do I go about it? Are there any tools or instruments I can use to measure the impact? And my response is generally, yes, we have instruments. We have lots of different instruments. There are tools, definitely, and systems to measure and evaluate the impact. But my first question usually back is, well, what do you want to measure? All right, because we can measure a lot of different things, followed by something like, tell me more about the context of your service learning experience. Where is it taking place? Who is participating? What kinds of communities? For what purposes? That way I can determine which instruments and mechanisms would be most appropriate. So without knowing context, without knowing what is happening in the service learning experience, is very difficult to just adopt instruments and protocols and metrics that are in existence. So what does this mean then, that we have to customize every single evaluation instrument and tool and measure for every service learning experience? And the answer to that is maybe. The good news is that as the service learning field has matured, we have developed and are learning about some common effective strategies for measuring service learning, and I'll share some of those with you. And that there are some foundational issues that are true for all types of service learning experiences, the thing that makes it service learning. And so with that, we can then identify some of these tools, approaches that are applicable across different types of contexts. So, but to be clear, there is no one best way to measure the impact of service learning, and there's no one perfect instrument that will do it. And some considerations need to be taken into account really to develop a viable and effective strategy. So I'd like to offer a few considerations as for those of us who are thinking about this, some strategies and some approaches for how to go about it. So the first thing, obviously, is to take stock of what we want to measure. What is the question or focus of that evaluation? What impacts are we interested in? What do we expect those outcomes to be? What do we want to measure? All right. This is at the core, really, of being able to measure and conduct a effective evaluation. Now, while this consideration seems obvious, there is a propensity in our service learning field to want to apply existing instruments and measures. As I mentioned, people ask that for those. Perhaps we take those found in the literature. We're very fortunate now to have more than 1,000 studies of service learning that have been done, actually almost 1,500 studies that have been published that talk about the impacts and outcomes of service learning. And we tend to maybe look at those studies and take those instruments and want to use them. And as we know, as I mentioned, service learning has so many different dimensions and stakeholders. Therefore, if we're going to take a look at those kinds of instruments, we have to be very careful how we apply them, because we have to take a look at the context in which those have been built, how they've been validated, on which populations, for what purposes. And the purposes that we want to measure and the particular communities or contexts or nature of the students, whatever it might be, those have to be commensurate to some extent. Otherwise we run into the validation issue of the instrument. Part of the challenge too is there's so many different things to measure in service learning. And as we look at the field of service learning and the research, we know that service learning really can affect students in a variety of different ways. And the literature and the studies of service learning have looked at all these different potential outcomes, positive outcomes for students around all these different dimensions. And therefore, if we want to measure some kind of outcome, which of these outcomes are we looking for? These are all potential outcomes of service learning. Which are the ones that we're most interested in? Right? Oftentimes we want to look at the academic outcomes, and that's a question we get asked often. And there are quite a bit of studies looking at potential. These are just some of the potential outcomes, but there are many different outcomes, grade point averages, and other kinds of things that we see potentially positive. And then all these other areas. And so, again, the research is mixed on all of these. Where we see the most positive outcomes, the most consistent findings, the stronger effect sizes are in which area? What do you think? Anyone want to venture a guess? Of these dimensions, where do you think we see the strongest, most positive, consistent findings across many different types of service learning experiences? How many of you say academic? How many of you say career? Civic? I don't know if this is a shy group or not. Ethical, moral? Okay. Personal? Ooh. Social. Okay. Yeah, most of the positive findings are in the personal and social domains, more than the academic. The academic ones tend to be mixed. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay. We also see for teachers, faculty members, we also see impact on them, on their feeling of efficacy for teaching, relationship with their students, relationship with communities, their teaching satisfaction. So there's some positive outcomes there. For our institutions as well, in terms of building a campus climate, town-gown relationships with external communities, and the fulfillment of our mission. You know, we say in higher education, we do research to benefit society. We prepare students for productive citizenship and lifelong learning, and we serve the communities, right? So we have that service mission and engagement mission in our tripartite mission, higher education. So we see some positive outcomes there. And then, of course, the impact on the community. And this is where actually we have less research. And I think this is one of the hardest things to measure in service learning um, for lots of reasons. And I'll talk about that just in a little while. So these are the areas where we do see positive outcomes from service learning impact. So what do we want to measure? Right? Which outcomes are we looking for? And this becomes one of the important questions then, is to really be clear on what it is that we want to measure, what it is that our particular servicing experiences are purporting to achieve, right? What objectives do we have? And then what do we want to achieve? So it's important to decide which stakeholder group we're looking to identify as our unit of analysis, so to speak, and decide what it is that we want to measure. And our evaluation plan can be very narrowly focused. We could say we want to look at a specific outcome for student, or it could be very broad to say that we want to evaluate a lot of things, right? And that's going to shape our approach to how we um, uh, address our servicing experience. So I want to use an example and work through it with you just to get a sense of potentials of how we need to think through evaluating the impact. So this is an experience at my university in our School of Business Management. And these are students in this course that are learning techniques and strategies for designing and developing and implementing a social enterprise. That's the course. It's the students have to design and develop a social enterprise and use service learning as a means to design um, uh, the social enterprise and build understanding of business techniques and marketing techniques as part of the course. And these groups of students, so students get to decide what they're interested in, and this group of students wanted to do something for autistic children with autism. And they started to learn about children with autism, and they learned that children with autism need an ongoing stimulation in their lives. And they enjoy having opportunities to have a lot of manipulatives, something that they're constantly using and manipulating as a way to keep them centered. And also, they really enjoy hugging and feeling this sense of hugging. So what these students did, they decided to design this backpack. And you see the young boy there with the backpack, and they call it the Nestle Pack. And what this Nestle Pack did was it has these manipulatives that are part in these pockets, and then it also mimics hugging. And it's a way to keep children with autism feeling safe and feeling comforted and centered. And so these students designed this, they prototyped it, they patented it, and then raised money to be able to $30,000 to be able to then distribute it to schools to give out to children with autism. So that was the project. So if we are to identify and evaluate the impacts and the outcomes of this, who are the potential stakeholders to assess? And what are some possible impact areas? And so oftentimes, the impact areas we're looking for are those that we articulate with the curriculum, the course objectives, right? The marketing and the business techniques and how to design, how to build a social enterprise. And in the above case, the goal was for doing service learning was to give students that experience of designing and developing that social enterprise. But there are many other things we could measure as potential outcomes. So the point here is that there are a lot of different stakeholders in service learning that sometimes the default is what we do in the classroom and the objectives of the classroom. And that with service learning, it's very important to consider all the other potential stakeholders and participants that are part of this as ways to help evaluate the impact of that work. And so this becomes a comprehensive approach to evaluation that it becomes very important to really capturing those outcomes and impacts. Not just on student learning, but also the impact it might have on the community and those whom we're serving. Again, it is service learning. So there is an impact area that we need to really take into account. So that's one important area, first of all, to have a clear objective of what it is that we want to assess, but also then understanding that we need to take a look at the broad range of participants. So one of the things that we do is to really get that clarity on what we want to measure, and that is really the first fundamental step. And fortunately, I would just say we do have systems now and guidebooks and other kinds of things that guide us. For those of you who are interested in learning more about procedures and approaches to really taking into account all the different stakeholders who might be involved. This is one of the volumes that I would recommend by Cheryl Gelman and Barbara Holland. It's just been updated just a few years ago in 2018. And it gives you a sense of the different approaches for principles, strategies for assessing service learning, but then talks about how to think about the student impact. How to think about that would be the student service learning provider, the service learner. How to think about the impact on the teachers and the faculty who facilitate and offer the service learning experience, how to think about the community impact, and how to think about the institution, how the institution might be affected. They offer different methods and analyses, and they also provide instruments, examples of instruments and measures that you can use, that you can adapt, that are really applicable to a lot of different service learning situations. Okay, so just to know that there are these guides that are out there. So again, having a sense of what we want to measure becomes really central and important. But sometimes we don't know what to measure. Sometimes we're not really sure what impact we want to see or might see from service learning. Sometimes they're not, some service learning experience can surprise us in the outcomes. So we want to be able to capture those, and we may not know. So in this case, I recommend applying some of the generic assessment tools that are available that measure a broad range of outcomes of service learning as a way to see where your service learning experiences may fall in terms of particular outcome areas. And there are various instruments, scales designed, and protocols designed to do this, both qualitative and quantitative. And they're designed specifically for service learning programs. They're applicable, as I mentioned, to different programs. And these tend to focus more on breadth than depth. So what we talked about earlier, specific outcomes, we tend to dig around a particular outcome area, and we want to measure like the criteria for social entrepreneurship, right? We would have a set of criteria. In these cases, these are items, for example, on a questionnaire or survey that might cover 8 or 9 different constructs or outcome areas. And there may be just 1 or 2 items or 3 items on that area. And it's just a way to get a generic way of thinking, where did my service learning tend to fall? And there are a lot of these different scales. These scales tend to be generic, as I mentioned. You can apply them. They tend to be more broad. They contain some psychometric properties and the ones that I'm sharing with you have been tested in different realms. So you'll see some Cronbach alphas and those kinds of things that show how the items hang together for the quantitative ones. And you can use them at the end of your service learning to say, okay, where do my students fall in these areas? You know, from I'll share one with you, or you can use them as pre-post to look at gains. Where were they at the beginning and where were they at the end? And here's just some of them. We developed one years ago at Berkeley when I was there, and it covers academic, career, civic, and empowerment outcomes. Um, Barbara Maley and her team did more around civic attitudes, and that's widely used a lot in the literature. A lot of the articles use the CASC, the Civic Attitudes and Skills one. Number two, the Tonkar one is one that covers a lot of areas: personal, social, career, civic, and academic. Also has strong psychometrics to it. And then there's one actually in Europe that's been developed, the questionnaire for self-assessment, service learning experience in higher education. And this is more for implementers, for teachers who implement service learning. So it's a scale for the teachers. So for example, this is, I don't know if you can see that, if you can read it on way in the back there, but these are kind of the scales. This is the CELEB one that Tonkar and colleagues have developed. And this is what I'm talking about. So it covers a lot of different areas on a scale of 7 to 1, 7 being very much so, 1 being not at all. So it covers things from personal growth, working with others, leadership, communication, community involvement, self-confidence, conflict resolution, empathy, workplace skills, organizational skills, connecting theory practice, a lot of different areas. All right, so it's just a way to get a sense of where are my students scoring more highly, and might this tell me something about my service learning experience that then we can dig a little deeper in looking at potential impacts. So maybe the service learning experience, type of service learning experience, tend to lean students in a certain outcome area. We can then explore that a little more, a little further to say maybe this is an important outcome of my service learning experience. So this is how these are often used. So if we're not sure what we want to measure, I recommend looking at some of these tools that are more generic as a way to begin to test out some of the potential outcomes that we might see. The other way, and like I said, this gives us a snapshot. Now, one of the more common approaches that we do see is we tend to take a lot of existing instruments, not necessarily designed for service learning, but have very strong psychometrics to them that are borrowed from other disciplines and other fields, like psychology and sociology and public health and other fields, that we say, okay, it's been well tested. Rosenberg self-esteem scale, we see that over and over and over again, right? And so we adopt it for service learning. And that's fine to do. And again, thinking about the validation of that instrument and on whom and what populations was validated and what its best uses are becomes really important, because once we move too far away from how that's been validated, then we lose that validation and the reliability of it. But Bob Bringle, who's one of our scholars in the field, well-known scholars in the field, went and pulled together some of these well-tested, validated instruments from a lot of different fields and combined them in this book called The Measure of Service Learning. And these they're very specific scales: self-concept, self-esteem. It talks about things about moral development. It talks about there's some for community as well around empowerment scales. So I actually had a copy of the book and I forgot to bring it. I actually brought it here and I forgot to bring it. It has all these different validated scales with all the psychometric information included. So if that's something that is important that you want to use, those scales are available, and this is a great volume to use as a way to look at some of the outcome areas that service learning has been promoting and has been found in many different situations. Again, using these in a very careful way, but it could be a very important use of them. The other thing I want to mention around this is that there are also, similar to this, community partnership protocols that have been tested in fields like public health, in medicine, in some of the sociological constructs where we're working with specific cultures and communities, in ethnic studies, in other study areas. We find some scales, some protocols that have been well tested, and those can be adapted to some of the service learning experiences, especially when we're working in similar contexts and with similar populations. And those are available. And I think there's a compendium that's going to be coming out soon, qualitative tools for community engagement, that are going to have some of these involved. So hopefully that'll be available soon. But here are just a couple of them. There's the problem-solving interview protocol. This is one that asks students in particular around their strategies in response to specific social problem. This is a qualitative tool that Janet Eiler and Giles used in their 5-year study that they did in the early 2000s. There's a book called Where's the Learning in Service Learning? And this is one of the scales that they've used that many others have used. And then the community partner interview protocol. This is about, these are semi-structured interviews, questions that focus on community partners' perspectives. And this has been used quite a bit since it came out. So these are just some qualitative tools. Again, some cautions about, the appropriateness of how to apply them. And now that we're working in Europe, where we have many different cultures and language and national identities and religions and all the different things to consider, we have to be very, very careful about how to take these US-based instruments, these English language instruments, and apply them in a multilinguistic setting. So again, there are things out there. My pitch here is just that whenever we use existing instruments, to really get a sense of what that instrument is really all about, how it was developed, for what purposes, and try to identify how close it is to what it is that we want to measure, and to understand the limitations of that in case it goes a little too far afield. Now, another strategy then is, well, we have these instruments, these are great, but they're not going to fit for what I want to do. So what can we do? Well, another is to adapt the instruments, right? And an adaptation of instruments can be helpful, and they've been done. For example, Patty Clayton and colleagues did this reflection to evaluate impact, taking existing instruments and developed something called DEAL, where students, they took a reflection tool. Reflection is very important in service learning. I call it analysis. I don't call it reflection, because reflection, and this gets to critical reflection oftentimes in service learning is, what did you do on your experience, right? And really what we want is critical reflection. We want students to analyze not just what they did, but what did they learn? What did they experience? What changed? The so what of the work that they did. And that becomes really key and really important. That's what Clayton and colleagues did, to take reflection tools and develop them into more critical reflection. So students describe, they're on in that gray box there, students describe the experience, this is what I did. Then they examine the experience in light of specified learning objectives that we have in the course, or specific personal objectives we have for students that we want them to achieve, and their civic engagement. And then they articulate their learning in the reflections, what they learned, what growth that they have because of the experience. And that becomes a mechanism to then evaluate what students have done. Which takes us to a next piece of strategy for evaluating the impact, that we can use reflection as a tool to assess impact. Sometimes we see reflection as something we do, and then we do the assessment of student learning or student outcomes. But reflection in and of itself can be the assessment tool. So here is an example of how we might ask that in a reflection question. Let's say we have a group of students working on homelessness. One of the questions we might ask them, for example, is now that you've engaged with the neighborhood agency on homelessness, reflect on what you consider to be the causes of homelessness, the challenges of homelessness, and the services you believe are most important for homeless individuals and families. What outcomes, what learning outcomes are we measuring here? So this is a social welfare course where students are learning about, they're learning to go into social welfare work. And so they're doing this experience. So this is getting more at the societal issue, understanding of the societal issues. So it's not just, I don't want to say just, but it's the difference between serving food at the homeless shelter and maybe working with the homeless and getting that experience, that observation, getting familiarity with the issue, and going beyond that by now understanding, well, what are the causes? Right? What are the challenges? What are the services that are needed? Right? So it's getting our students to think about the societal issue. And this is where we get to deeper impact of service learning, when the reflection itself guides students to think critically and deeper about that societal issue. That making sense? So that's really more about content of the societal issue. And here's another one where we could where we might have perspectives from the community perspectives being really important. So I might have my students work with a community group, and at the end, I might say, my students have engaged with you to work through issues you are facing, and I might ask them a series of questions to give me feedback on my students' experience. As a result, excuse me, of my students' involvement, have conditions changed for you? If so, how? Is there any benefit that you believe my students have provided? Please share. We're not assuming that it did have a benefit. Right? Were there any benefits? Maybe they say no. What would be a circumstance for you today if my students have not worked for you? What difference did they make? Would you want my students to join in the future or not? So again, this is reaching out to the communities with which we partner to get their input and their sense and their valuable voice and perspective. And this is something that's often missing from our assessments and evaluations of impact. We don't ask the community, right? We ask the students what they thought their impact was. We don't ask the community, did they have some impact, right? So the strategy for evaluating the impact often can be improved by asking the community around it. Okay. But using reflection becomes really important. The other strategy for evaluating service learning impact is through the service learning experience itself. And this could be a little tricky. So this is especially useful when measuring the impact on student learning, in particular, academic learning in particular. So we want to know if there's an impact on students' advancement of particular knowledge and skills. So going back to that Nestle pack experience with the young boy autism, the purpose of that course was to teach students how to design, develop, and implement a social enterprise, excuse me. The service learning experience then became the means for students to demonstrate that they understood and knew how to develop those skills. They developed the skills to know how to carry out that social enterprise. So the service learning experience became the assessment measure. Does that make sense? And how well they carried that out evaluated whether they learned it or not. So service learning can actually be an assessment tool based on the application of what students are learning in the classroom. So it's another way that we assess impact on students through service learning. That can be a little tricky to do. So it's not the impact of service learning, but the impact via service learning. All of that's all great and good, But one of the things that's really important that we haven't really touched upon that I think is essential is that all these impacts are great, but they only work when service learning is of high quality. Because I'll even admit, not all service learning is great. And in fact, there is such a thing as bad service learning. When it's done pretty poorly, it can reinforce stereotypes. It could do a lot of things that, and a lot of damage if we're not careful. So quality service learning becomes important. So one of the things that we do when we have to assess the impacts of service learning is to also assess the quality of the implementation and to determine whether what we did was of high quality. Because if students are not getting, if not getting the impacts we hope, maybe it wasn't that the students didn't achieve it. Maybe it's the servicing experience itself was not of high quality. So we know a lot from literature what goes into high quality. These are fundamental quality indicators for service learning quality. Okay, you have to have meaningful service, has to be integrated with curriculum. The duration intensity has to be of sufficient length and depth. You have to have that reflection, that analysis. You have to have some student ownership, agency in the development of it, like that NestlePack group, right? You have to monitor it, have to have diversity of perspectives and students being able to have voice in it, and you have to have strong partnerships. All those things matter. So how do we assess our quality? Well, there are some rubrics. There are checklists. Yes, no, meaningful service, yes or no. Was it meaningful? That's judgmental, right? There's some rubrics that have a scale. But they're also quantitative one. And so I like to share one we worked on actually in the US as part of a US Department of Education national grant funded process where we came up with a quantitative measure that gives you a score for your quality. Why did we develop this? Because we did a multi-site study where we wanted to assess the impact of service learning on underrepresented students across multiple institutions. And so we had the measures, the outcomes of persistence and retention and graduation rates, all the things that we want to see for underrepresented students. In our case, it was students of color, students who are low social economic status, first-generation students at the higher education. The problem we had was we had a whole list of service learning courses, over 100 service learning courses that we were looking at, but we didn't know if they were all high quality or not. So if we were going to feed them into our analyses, we may be feeding poorly designed courses that then would affect our results. So we had to find a way to measure the quality of these courses. So we said one way to do is come up with a quantitative measure. We reviewed the literature, all those standards of high quality practice. We came up with originally like 65, we narrowed it down to 30, 28 ultimately, and across these 5 dimensions. One was, how is the course designed? And we have these 10 dimensions. We have the learning focus. Is there a specific, clear learning objectives? I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with all of you if you like. I want to finish this up because I want to get your questions. Student focus, instructor focus, and community partner focus, these 28 elements. And then what we did was we say, okay, we have these 28 elements, but you know what? They're not all equal. They're not all equal. It's kind of like a meal, right? Let's say we're doing chicken and rice meal. I like chicken rice, so I'll pick the chicken and rice meal, right? So you could have chicken and the rice and vegetables and salt and pepper and celery and other things that you put in. So all those ingredients are not equal. They're all needed to make a delicious chicken and rice meal. But if you leave out the chicken, it's not chicken and rice anymore. If you leave out the rice, it's not chicken. But you can leave out the pepper. It may not be as high quality, but it's still chicken and rice. That making sense? So we wanted to say, well, how do we rank these? How do we categorize these? And we went through this process, a multi-year process, where we asked practitioners and scholars to rate these on a scale of 0 to 9, 1 to 9, excuse me, 1 to 9. And we said, how important are these? So this is how the scale kind of broke down. You can't really see this. But number 6 is reflection. Okay, that was the most important one. And then you had all these other ones. I won't go through the whole thing, but you get the sense. So I'm sorry, number 2 is reflection. My apologies. Number 9, that's weighted the most. All right, and then you have all these other ones you kind of see in the middle, 7.5 and 6. Then what we did was we said, okay, so these then become the weights, what we call the baseline. So you have reflection, which is 9.0. But you could do really, really good reflection multiple times, deep reflection, critical reflection, or you can do reflection once. It's still there, but maybe not as potent. So then we decided, well, maybe what we need is gradations. And we took that 9 and we said, okay, if you kind of do it, you kind of touch on it, you get 25% less of your baseline score of your weight. If you do it really, really well, you get extra bonus points, another 25%. Does that make sense? And if you don't have it at all, you get a 0, because that's an important ingredient. All these are important ingredients, but if you don't have it, it's a 0. But if you have the reflection, you get a 9, or more than 9, 25%, or less than 9, 25%. Okay, so it kind of looks like this, the scale. The first one is evidence that the course has expectations for it's articulated in the syllabus and in the course design. Okay, students know that this is part of it. That's 7.5. And then you have kind of a rubric and all that. I'm happy to share this instrument with you. So at the end, you can get a score for your service. And so we scored all of the service learning, and we said these are the low ones, these are the medium ones, these are high quality ones, and we could actually do better analyses. And we saw the ones with the higher quality actually had the impact on the students. Okay, and this is kind of like if you want to know what your score might be. If you had a score with all 20 elements at the baseline, the second bullet, it would be 215.5. That would be your baseline, and then below and above. Okay, and we found that about 212 is where that's where the quality indicators, in terms of the outcomes that we found, that's kind of where the critical point was for outcomes. Okay, I want to end by just quickly some common mistakes we make. A lot of what we do is our expectations are too lofty. When I review proposals for grants, for example, for service learning, we're going to reduce poverty in our neighborhood. Well, if you can do that in a 20-week or 15-week course, that's going to be terrific. I mean, that everybody would be doing it, right? So sometimes our expectations are really lofty. So one of the things is thinking about what can we realistically accomplish in the time we have, okay? And maybe it's just one step, and that's okay, right? But sometimes we set very lofty, and then we get disappointed. Oh, it doesn't work. It's too much work. It doesn't work. We set outcomes that we can't measure or difficult to measure. I'm working with a program called Uniseritate. We have a few people here who are part of this. This is about advancing service learning in Catholic education, higher education. One of the things we want to measure, how do you measure that? You know, that's one of the goals. We want to measure. It's like, what is it? How do you measure it? What does it look like? And right, do you give a survey? You know, what do you do? Right. So sometimes we pick things that are very difficult to measure or not even measurable. We misapply these evaluation instruments and measures. I see that sometimes. People say, oh, we didn't find anything, and we look and we say, well, this doesn't really measure what you thought you were measuring. We misattribute outcomes and impact to service learning. This happens a lot in when we look at community impacts, that we see a change in the community. Oh, it must have been because of my service learning that the students did. Well, the community operates multisectorally with a lot of influences in a community, and it may not just be that 15-week service learning experience. And lastly, just less is more, right? We tend to over these big productions of evaluations and impacts that just become burdens, filling out surveys and instruments and things. And sometimes pinpointing and doing less can actually get us more and more data. So I just want to offer you some strategies, some things that we're thinking about in our service learning impact and evaluation. And I'll end there because I'd love to hear your questions and things that are on your mind that perhaps we didn't get a chance to talk about. So thank you.